trying to think, like, here's some of the objections to becoming a nun, right? Like, the more superficial ones are like, you don't get to have sex, and like
It's true.
nice clothes and stuff, and cool
I will say,
handbags.
as far as the clothing thing, I will say it's kind of nice to not have to figure out what I'm going to wear
Dude,
each day.
preach it. Do you know this is something that I've done? I've pretty much gotten rid of every shirt of mine that isn't black. So even though I don't have a religious
Matches
habit,
everything.
exactly. I
It's slimming.
Okay, but yeah, so like, I mean, because obviously there's the more substantial things which we should address too, like having a family and growing old with a husband and things like this. But I want to get, let's get to that later. Superficial
Sure,
stuff, sex and handbags. How did you deal with that?
sure.
Or was that not even
I
a,
not so much the handbags, but I miss jeans. I miss jeans a lot.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, and it's interesting. I think people can get this idea in their heads that priests and nuns and monks, because as you mentioned, monks are like the masculine parallel to a nun, right? So or brother. So priests, monks, and nuns. I think people often just kind of assume that we're like asexual or something. And
right,
that
right.
that we no longer, it's like you become a nun and you no longer experience like sexual desire. And this is just ridiculous. So and I think it would be the equivalent of saying that like when someone gets married, they no longer are sexually attracted to another human being, besides
That's
their
a
spouse. Like
great
also
analogy.
ridiculous. And um so yeah, it's definitely there, but your question of
I suppose, I mean, that objection really comes from the world, I suppose, because
sure.
I suppose like those who aren't living the Catholic faith may be living a lifestyle in which they do hook up or have, somewhat intimate relationships with different people. But I remember for me, when I was discerning the priesthood, it wasn't like, oh, now I can't have sex. Because for me, my only options were two relationships in a sense. It was like I could get married or I could it wasn't like I can have multiple sexual. I don't think that's what a lot of people,
Right.
especially who are on the path to religious life, are thinking about anyway. So maybe I phrased that wrong, but I suppose that's kind of more of a secular sort of objection. That's probably one you get when you're, I don't know. Do you run into like random people at pubs and places who ask those
Well,
sorts of
I'm not
things?
I'm not really frequenting the pubs, but I but I do come across this. I meet some pretty bold secular people, and I like those people. I like those conversations, you
I
know.
Yeah, I bet they've met their
So
match. I'm sure you do a great job with them.
yeah, it's pretty fun.
Tell us about one of the conversations.
Um, well, it was more so I encountered this a lot before I entered the monastery, right? So when I first became a missionary, I ran into a professor who most certainly will never listen to this podcast, but he was a physics professor that I had, and he was so frustrated by my mission work. I promise this is getting to the point. He was so frustrated by my mission work because he's like, thousands of people can deliver diapers and or anyone can deliver diapers, and only one in 1,000 can do the physics that you can do. And so like this is a waste. And I received, so it's, I think that is the greatest. I think that's the greatest objection I get from the
Yeah.
secular mindset is that it's a waste.
Yes.
Whether they're referencing, they might be talking about not having sex, but they're referencing it in the sense of um, it's wasteful to not act on that desire when you could have what you desire. And so I encountered this I was a teacher, a high school teacher before I entered the monastery for a year, and some of my coworkers, one of them called me an effing idiot,
Nice.
and others just told me what a waste it was, and they did talk about not having sex, but they more frequently referenced what you already touched on of not having a family. But what I found so interesting is that it's this mindset of sacrifice for the sake of intimacy with the Lord
Mm,
is what is so not understood by secular society, because these same people, the same people who were thinking it very odd that I would give up sex and a family for the sake of pursuing this vocation. If I had told them I'm not having a family for the sake of my career, they would be fully supportive. Same people, you know? So it's not simply that they think family is the most fulfilling thing. It's that they found my motivation for it to be unfathomable.
Yeah, that's a really great distinction. It's almost like if God doesn't exist, then what you're doing does seem like it's a bit ridiculous. And I think for many people, even people who would say they have some vague belief in God, they really don't believe in God, or that intimacy with Christ is an actual, real, legitimate, non-fictitious thing that you're capable of having. And so I think that's really what it gets down to, people just lacking faith. So, for example, I had people in my family, when I told them I was discerning the priesthood, they were like, well, why not just become a social worker? And that reveals so much, right? It reveals that they're basically doing the same thing. One is a bit weird and the other one doesn't have to be.
Sure. Yeah. I did remember one encounter I had since entering the monastery of one of these seculars who just like didn't get it. We went, a family took us skiing a few years back. So we went skiing in our full habits and it was very fun.
Beautiful.
And I don't think any of us snowboarded. I think we all skied. I'll tell you though, skiing in Ohio is very different than skiing in Colorado. But anyways, I'm on the ski lift with a man who is a ski instructor, but he's off shift, and I just wish I'd had another nun with me. I did for one of the lifts, but he and I got on the same lift again. And he'd had a couple whiskeys under his belt at that point, I think. And so he's just not holding back. And he says, so he's asking us about like TV shows. And we're like, yeah, we don't really watch TV. Like we have a TV, but we don't have cable or anything. We just like, once a month or so we'll watch a movie together. We watched Sound of Music last week, and that was or a couple weeks ago, so that was fun. Appropriate. So he's like, you don't watch TV? And we're like, no, not really. A couple episodes of Star Trek every once in a while. And then he says, well, but like, how do you get your fix? And he's just so completely baffled, and he's like, because you're so happy. You're both so happy. And he's absolutely bewildered, He's like, you don't have TV and you don't have sex and you don't have, how are you happy? And
you just want to say, have you met the millions of people who are not short on either and are miserable?
Yeah, right. So including this man, clearly.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this clip. You can click here to watch the full episode. And I want to say a big thanks to our sponsors and to our amazing patrons for making all of this possible. Please do us a favor before you go. Click that subscribe button and then the bell. And that way YouTube will be forced to let you know every time we put out a new episode.